We pay and do not receive. Why promised weapons are not arriving in Ukraine. The West failed to deliver part of the weapons promised to Ukraine, while another part was not fit for use in the conflict, the New York Times reported. The publication notes that between February 2022 and the end of last year, Kiev delivered more than $800 million to arms suppliers to pay for contracts that turned out to be impossible to fulfill in whole or in part. The newspaper cites Ukrainian documents, sources, and the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Two sources involved in Kiev's arms purchases say some of the missing weapons were eventually handed over, and some of the money was returned. However, contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars were still outstanding this spring. We had cases when we paid the money and did not receive it, said Deputy Minister Vladimir Gavrilov. Furthermore, weapons provided as part of Western assistance often proved unsuitable for use by Ukrainian troops, requiring serious repairs or being only suitable to be dismantled for spare parts. The newspaper adds, experts point out that at any given time period, around 30 of Kiev's guns are under repair. However, Ukraine sometimes refrains from criticizing Western suppliers so as not to embarrass allies who are helping it. However, a Ukrainian official told the newspaper that Kiev is tired of being told it has enough weapons and, at the same time, receiving broken weapons or suffering breach of contracts. Ukrainian documents indicate, for example, that Kiev paid $19.08 million to U.S. supplier Ultra Defense Corporation to repair howitzers. They were later sent back to Ukraine but were in unsuitable combat duty condition. In the spring of 2022, Russia sent a note to the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, regarding the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Moscow has repeatedly noted that any cargo containing weapons to Kiev will become a legitimate target for the Russian military. One more news. Stoltenberg. NATO stockpiles emptied due to support for Ukraine. The alliance's Secretary General called on member states to produce a stronger defense sector amid problems related to pro-Kiev supplies. NATO stockpiles are empty due to support for Kiev and urgently need to be replenished, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Monday during the German Industry Day economic conference. Stoltenberg said last week he had discussed urgent resupply options with defense industry representatives from alliance member states. We need a stronger defense sector whose representatives are gathered here today. Our arms and ammunition stockpiles are empty and need to be replenished not only in Germany, but also in many NATO countries, said the senior official. On Sunday, Stoltenberg spoke out against freezing the Ukrainian conflict, as well as its conclusion on Russia's terms. According to him, NATO will continue to support Ukraine. Senior officials and officials in Western countries have repeatedly identified low inventories and production levels as impediments to further support for Kiev. One more news. Kiev says the only way to end the conflict is not a truce, but army reinforcements. The advisor to the Chief of Staff of the President of Ukraine, Mikhail Podolyak, said on his Twitter that the only way to end the conflict with Russia is for Kiev to maximize its military capabilities and take back the territories. No truce, which the white-coated peacemakers are so eager to achieve, can bring peace. The only way to end war is through the return of respect for international law. This includes maximizing the military capabilities of the Ukraine and Russia's economic and political isolation, Podolyak tweeted. The result of these steps, according to him, should be the return of territories. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, speaking at the G20 summit in Indonesia in mid-November 2022, proposed a 10-point formula for restoring peace in Ukraine, which includes, in particular, restoring the country's territorial integrity, withdrawing of Russian troops, and the restoration of justice. Moscow has repeatedly indicated it is ready for talks, but Kiev has legislated a ban on them. One more news. Lula says the EU cannot threaten Mercosur to sign a trade agreement. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva commented that the European Union cannot threaten the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, by signing the trade agreement between the two blocs, stating that he will talk to his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron about the subject. I want to discuss with Macron the issue of the approval by the French Parliament of the tightening of the Mercosur. agreement. The EU cannot threaten Mercosur. We are strategic partners, said Lula in the second edition of Conversa como President when talking about his trip to Europe this week. The president added in the program broadcast live on his social networks that in Paris, he will participate in a public event in front of the Eiffel Tower to talk about the environment with various political leaders and artists. In mid-June, the French Parliament passed a resolution against ratification of the free trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur due to environmental disputes. The EU and Mercosur signed the agreement in 2019 after 20 years of negotiations, but some countries refused to ratify it until the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro committed to adopting a series of environmental measures, especially control of deforestation. Lula also informed that on his trip to Europe, he will meet with Pope Francis to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. I took the liberty of calling the Pope and asked to visit him. I want to talk about the war and inequality in the world. I had already visited the Pope before the pandemic, and we talked about fighting hunger. World conscience to be indignant against hunger in the world. The problem is not lack of food production, wrote Lula in his Twitter account. In the interview, the president recalled that he has already met the pontiff twice and added that Francis is unequivocally the Pope most committed to the humble people of the world.